Right now, something unusual is happening inside your mind. You are thinking in a language. Not speaking, thinking. Every idea forming in your head, every memory that quietly surfaces, every plan you make about the future is unfolding through a system of words you learned many years ago. A system so familiar that it feels completely invisible. You rarely notice it. You simply use it. But what if that system is doing more than helping you communicate? What if the language you learned as a child is quietly shaping the way you experience reality itself? For most of modern history, scientists believed language was just a tool. First, you perceive the world. Then, you use words to describe it. Simple. Reality comes first, language comes second. That idea felt obvious, almost unquestionable. But during the last few decades, researchers studying language began to notice patterns that didn't quite fit that explanation. People who grew up speaking different languages sometimes behaved differently in subtle cognitive tasks. At first, these differences seemed small, almost trivial. But the more experiments scientists conducted, the more intriguing the results became. Because the differences weren't random, they followed the structure of the language people spoke. One of the most famous experiments started with something incredibly simple: the color blue. Researchers invited volunteers into a laboratory and showed them rows of colored squares on a screen. Each row contained many squares of the same color, except one. One square was slightly different. The task was straightforward: find the odd one out. Most participants could do it quickly. But when Russian speakers took the same test, something interesting happened. They performed the task faster than English speakers. Not slightly faster, consistently faster. Over and over again. At first, this result seemed puzzling. Why would speakers of one language detect colors faster than speakers of another? Their eyesight wasn't different. Their eyes were not more sensitive. Their brains were not structured differently. But their language was. Because in Russian, there isn't just one word that covers the entire range we call blue. There are two. One word refers specifically to light blue. Another refers specifically to dark blue. To Russian speakers, those colors belong to separate linguistic categories, almost like the difference between red and orange. So when the odd square crossed that boundary between light blue and dark blue, their brains recognized the contrast faster. The difference felt clearer, more immediate. The language they had spoken their entire lives had subtly trained their perception. Not dramatically, not in a way they consciously noticed, but enough to measurably influence how quickly their brain detected a color difference. And this discovery opened the door to a much bigger question. If language can influence something as basic as color perception, what else might it influence? As researchers continued exploring this idea, they began to find more examples. And some of them were far stranger. Because in certain parts of the world, language doesn't just affect how people describe space, it changes how they navigate it entirely. Here on Immerged, we explore discoveries like this. Ideas that seem simple at first, until you realize they quietly reshape how the human mind works. And when scientists began studying languages spoken in remote parts of Australia, they discovered something extraordinary. Because some languages don't use words like left or right at all. Not sometimes, never. And that changes the way people understand the world around them in ways that are almost impossible to imagine. Imagine trying to describe where something is. In English, the answer feels obvious. You would say the object is on your left, or maybe slightly to your right. If it's farther away, you might say it's in front of you, or behind you. This way of describing space feels so natural that we rarely question it. We orient the world around our own bodies: left, right, forward, backward. But not every language works this way. In Northern Australia, there are communities whose languages contain no words for left or right. None. Instead, people describe space using cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. Not just outdoors, inside houses, inside buildings, even when referring to objects on a table. A speaker might say something like, "There's a cup just south of your hand," or "There's an insect on your north leg." At first, this might sound almost impossible to use in everyday conversation, because to speak that way correctly, you must always know where north is, not occasionally, always. Inside a room, walking through a forest, waking up in the middle of the night. Researchers studying these communities quickly realized something fascinating. Speakers of these languages possess an extraordinary sense of orientation, not because they trained like navigators, but because their language demands it. If you constantly describe space using compass directions, your brain begins tracking those directions automatically. Scientists decided to test just how strong that ability really was. Participants were blindfolded, driven around on winding roads, turned in different directions several times. Then the blindfold was removed, and they were asked a simple question: where is north? Most people raised in modern cities would struggle to answer that question, even with time to think. But many participants from these communities pointed in the correct direction almost immediately, again and again, with remarkable accuracy. Their language had quietly trained their brains to maintain a constant mental compass. They weren't consciously calculating it. Their minds simply tracked direction as part of everyday awareness. The words they used every day shaped the way they navigated the world. And that means something remarkable. Two people can walk through the exact same landscape, yet carry completely different mental maps of it. One oriented around the body, the other oriented around the planet itself. Language wasn't just describing space, it was organizing it, guiding attention, highlighting certain patterns of reality. And this discovery pushed scientists to ask a deeper question. If language can influence how we perceive color and how we navigate space, could it also influence something far more abstract? Something we cannot see at all? Time. Think about how you imagine time. Without realizing it, most English speakers picture time as a horizontal line. The past stretches behind us. The future lies ahead. We even gesture this way when we talk, pointing backward when referring to yesterday, gesturing forward when speaking about tomorrow. It feels natural, almost intuitive. But this mental image isn't universal. In Mandarin Chinese, time is often described using vertical metaphors. Earlier events are described as being up. Later events are described as being down. At first glance, this might seem like a small linguistic difference, just a metaphor. But when psychologists began studying how speakers of different languages think about time, they noticed something curious. Mandarin speakers were faster at answering questions about time when visual cues were arranged vertically. English speakers were faster when the cues were arranged horizontally. In other words, the mental layout of time in the brain seemed to mirror the metaphors used in language. Language was gently shaping how abstract ideas were organized in the mind, not forcing a particular thought, but guiding the direction in which thoughts naturally flowed. Like grooves carved into a surface. Over time, ideas begin to move along those grooves more easily. But perhaps the most striking example of language influencing thought comes from a small community deep in the Amazon rainforest. A group known as the Piraha. Their language is one of the most unusual ever studied by linguists. It contains no words for numbers, not even basic numbers. No word for 1, no word for 2, no word for 3. Instead, quantities are described in very general terms, something like a small amount or a larger amount. When researchers tried teaching Piraha adults how to count, the lessons rarely stuck. Not because the people lacked intelligence, but because their language had never required precise numerical categories. Their culture focuses strongly on immediate experience. What can be seen? What can be heard? What is happening right now? Numbers simply weren't central to daily life. And because the language evolved within that culture, it reflects that worldview. Language and culture had grown together, shaping the ways people organized reality. Which leads to an intriguing possibility. If language influences how we categorize color, how we navigate space, and even how we structure time, then the language you speak might also influence the way you make decisions. And this is where things become even more fascinating, because modern neuroscience has begun exploring what happens when people learn more than one language. When someone learns a second language, something remarkable begins happening inside the brain. New neural pathways form, new patterns of association emerge. But researchers have discovered something even more surprising. The language people use can subtly influence the way they make decisions. In experiments involving bilingual participants, scientists noticed a consistent pattern. When people considered difficult choices in their native language, their responses tended to be more emotional, more immediate. But when the same choices were presented in a second language, participants often responded differently, more slowly, more analytically, more detached. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was measurable, and it suggested something profound. Language doesn't just express thoughts. Sometimes it shapes the emotional context in which those thoughts occur. Across the world, different languages highlight different aspects of reality. Russian divides the color blue into distinct categories. Some Australian languages anchor speakers to the compass at all times. Mandarin often maps time vertically. The Piraha language centers experience almost entirely on the present moment. Each language creates a slightly different framework for interpreting the world. And the language you grew up speaking quietly shaped your mind as well. You simply don't notice it, because it feels normal. It feels like reality itself. But the moment you begin learning another language, something interesting happens. Concepts that once felt obvious begin to look unfamiliar. Ideas that were easy to express become harder to translate. And entirely new ways of thinking begin to appear. Because every language is more than vocabulary. It's a lens, a way of dividing the infinite complexity of the world into meaningful patterns. And when the language changes, the lens changes too. Which raises a fascinating thought. If the language you speak influences how you perceive reality, then learning a new language might be one of the closest things we have to experiencing the world through someone else's mind. Here on Immerged, we explore questions that reveal just how strange and remarkable the human mind can be. Because sometimes, the most powerful forces shaping our thoughts are the ones we never notice.